20th Century Tribalism. Part 3. The US Experience. Totalitarianism and corporatism. It appeared that fascism could provide a more coherent kind of political representation than was possible in a liberal state, and could also organise the working class better than socialism. The fascist criticisms of the representational ambitions of liberal democracy are hard to resist. What matters to each person are the unique circumstances of his life, his ambitions, his dreams, not some abstract entity called justice or the like, whereas the ideal liberal voter is supposed to vote only for the common good when he enters the polling booth. In a liberal democracy, then, according to fascist thought, the matter of voting is something of a charade in which an unreal man does something which to him must seem rather trivial if he thinks about the matter clearly at all. The fascist critique of the putative representational nature of liberal democracy is one thing. Its valorization of the collective and its demonization of the individual is quite another. While the philosophical and ideological antecedents of fascism go back to the 19th century, the rise of fascism as a political force is very much an effect of the moral, spiritual, economic and social devastation of the First World War. It shouldn't come as a surprise, but it almost invariably does, to realise that the first concrete expression of fascism in its totalitarian mode wasn't Mussolini's Italy or Hitler's Germany, but Woodrow Wilson's USA. Goldberg argues that during World War I, America became a fascist country, albeit temporarily. The first appearance of modern totalitarianism in the Western world wasn't in Italy or Germany, but in the United States of America. How else, he continues, except as totalitarian, would you describe a country where the world's first modern propaganda ministry was established? Political prisoners by the thousands were harassed, beaten, spied upon, and thrown in jail simply for expressing private opinions. The national leader accused foreigners and immigrants of injecting treasonous poison into the American bloodstream. Newspapers and magazines were shut down for criticizing the government. Nearly 100,000 government propaganda agents were sent out among the people to whip up support for the regime and its war. College professors imposed loyalty oaths on their colleagues. Nearly 250,000 goons were given legal authority to intimidate and beat slackers and dissenters. And leading artists and writers dedicated their crafts to proselytizing for the government. Woodrow Wilson and his associates were adherents of the socio-religious movement called progressivism. Progressivism was a development of certain residual puritanical elements in American society, and more directly an offshoot of the post-millennial pietist Protestantism that had conquered Yankee areas of northern Protestantism by the 1830s. Rothbard notes that pietists as post-millennialists, post-millennialism being the belief that Christ's second coming would happen only if and after the kingdom of God had been established on earth for 1,000 years. Post-millennialists attempted to use local, state and finally federal governments to stamp out sin, to make America and eventually the world holy, and thereby to bring about the kingdom of God on earth. With evident sincerity, Wilson's son-in-law could write to him, describing him, Wilson that is, as God's chosen instrument. Progressivism was driven by a quasi-religious certainty that its adherents knew what was good, not only for themselves, but for everyone else as well. Progressivists brought us prohibition and eugenics in the 1920s, and their descendants today bring us the war on smoking and the crusades against fat, salt, sugar, obesity, and drugs. But that's all right. They know what's good for you. And, let's be honest, you're really not capable of looking after yourself, are you? Progressivism had all the religious impulses and fervour of Puritanism, but its goal wasn't the greater glory of God, but the greater glory of the race and of the nation. If any elements of Christianity remained for progressivists, it was Christianity shorn of its transcendent beliefs. The social gospel was Christianity firmly harnessed to the needs of the state, a domesticated and docile Christianity. Progressivists had an abiding faith in the basic goodness of man, given the right environment, and they felt sure they could figure out scientific solutions to all problems through government studies, then shape the appropriate environments using government power. Wilson was a state worshipper. a believer in the state as an organic expression of the people. What of individual rights? The Declaration of Independence, he thought, talks a lot of nonsense about such things. Society is a living organism, and the Constitution, if it is to be fit for purpose, must be a living Constitution. Herbert Croly, editor of the New Republic and the author of the Bible of Progressivism, called The Promise of American Life, and one of the gurus of Wilsonian progressivism, endorsed war as a policy instrument. War was good for unifying the country and for imperial expansion. War, he wrote, may be and has been a useful and justifiable engine of national policy. And he supported both colonialism and imperialism. He wrote, colonial expansion by modern national states is to be regarded not as a cause of war, but as a safety valve against war. It affords an arena in which the restless and adventurous members of a national body can have their fling without dangerous consequences, while at the same time it satisfies the desire of a people for some evidence of and opportunity for national expansion. And speaking of what he calls the Asiatic and African peoples, Croly remarks that a European nation can undertake the responsibility of governing these politically disorganized societies without any necessary danger to its own national life. Such a task need not be beyond its physical power, because disorganized peoples have a comparatively small power of resistance, and a few thousand resolute Europeans can hold in submission many million Asiatics. Not only is there little danger to Europeans in engaging in such imperialistic adventures, but we may be assured that it is actually good for those who come under European control. At least for a while, the Asiatic population may well be benefited by more orderly and progressive government. Submission to such a government is necessary as a condition of subsequent political development, writes Croly. Some of the baleful effects of Wilson's progressivism are to be seen not only in respect of the governance of the United States, but also globally in his dismemberment of the Ottoman Empire, the geopolitical results of which are still with us 100 years later in the intractable Middle East disputes. The chaos of individualism could only be overcome by an heroic leader who could transcend the petty limitations of liberal democracy. Jeffersonian individualism being abandoned for the benefit of a genuinely individual and social consummation, writes Croly. Speaking about the traditional American conception of freedom, Croly wrote, up to a certain point, that freedom has been and still is beneficial. Beyond that point, it is not merely harmful, it is by way of being fatal. Efficient regulation there must be, and it must be regulation which will strike not at the symptoms of the evil, but at its roots. The existing concentration of wealth and financial power in the hands of a few irresponsible men is the inevitable outcome of the chaotic individualism of our political and economic organization. In becoming responsible for the subordination of the individual to the demand of a dominant and constructive national purpose, the American state will, in effect, be making itself responsible for a morally and socially desirable distribution of wealth. If that passage from Croly is reminiscent of Nazi Gleichschaltung and Italian corporatism, it is precisely because it is the native American version of the same thing. The writer of the introduction, Four, does concede that Croly's emphasis on nationalism and the special role that he assigned to enlightened elites contained faint resonances with European fascism. But he goes on to assure us that Croly's admiration for Mussolini was only for the early Mussolini, which he withdrew when Mussolini's authoritarianism became evident. Modern liberalism is in many ways the successor to Wilsonian progressivism. The aim of the liberal enterprise is to transform a democratic republic into an enormous tribal community, to inspire in every member of society from Key West, Florida to Fairbanks, Alaska, that same sense of belonging, we're all in it together, that we allegedly feel in a close-knit community. Ever since the New Deal, liberals have been unable to shake this fundamental dogma that the state can be the instrument for a politics of meaning that transforms the entire nation into a village. So writes Goldberg. Once fascism is understood for what it is, FDR's New Deal can be seen to be, in essence, fascistic. It was seen to be so by many in its own time, a reincarnation of Wilsonian progressivism for a new era. This movement, a grandchild of the French Revolution and a great-grandchild of the ideas of Rousseau, was characterized by imperialism, nationalism, militarism, racism, eugenicism, welfarism, and statism. The French Revolution was the first time that the attempt was made to transform politics into a religion, to make the transcendent immanent, to make heaven appear on earth, while real religion constantly reminds us that here we have no abiding city. Progressivism, communism, and fascism were subsequent attempts to religionize politics. None of these movements, I have argued, can properly be understood unless it is grasped that they were expressions of secular faiths. Before fascism became inextricably linked with anti-Semitism and the horror of the Holocaust, there was nothing particularly controversial in characterizing FDR's policies as fascist. The application of this term to his policies was often intended as a compliment. This is no longer so, and one often finds writers employing locutions such as X, fill in the name, was no fascist, but ... Indeed, with something less than his usual clarity, Jonah Goldberg writes, Franklin Roosevelt was no fascist ... but many of his ideas and policies were indistinguishable from fascism. One is left wondering how, if Roosevelt's ideas were indistinguishable from fascism, Roosevelt managed to preserve himself free from the stain of that political sin. The supposed threat of fifth column activities was used by Roosevelt to discredit any opposition to his plans for war. Roosevelt effectively used the fifth column issue to discredit and disgrace his isolationist opponents. He did not merely attack their views, he also challenged their loyalty. FDR lumped together actual spies in the employ of Hitler with his isolationist critics, writes MacDonald. It is hard to see how the George Washington of the farewell speech would have escaped the isolationist label. Roosevelt's treatment of Charles Lindbergh was particularly disgraceful. Lindbergh had accused the administration of recklessly leading America towards war, only to be vilified by Roosevelt as a covert Nazi. Howard Hicks, the Secretary of the Interior, described Lindbergh as America's #1 Nazi fellow traveller. Among the largely cowed and compliant press, the Chicago Tribune was pretty much the only paper to take issue with Roosevelt's employment of fifth column scaremongering, which the paper took to be a way of promoting his interventionist programs. Wilson's World War I alphabet agencies pale into insignificance beside the creations of Roosevelt's inventive genius. He produced the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission, the CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps, the FERA, Federal Emergency Relief Administration, the CWA, the Civil Works Administration, the NRA, National Recovery Administration, the AAA, Agricultural Adjustment Administration, and so on and so on. In 1941, after Pearl Harbor, internment camps for Japanese or Japanese Americans were set up by the WCCA, the Wartime Civil Control Administration, a decision supported by the shameful Supreme Court decision in Korematsu versus the United States. Roosevelt's Civilian Conservation Corps, the CCC, which recruited some 2.5 million men, was a paramilitary force designed to take young men off the streets and out of the civilian workforce. Hitler said of his programs that they would do exactly the same thing. The CCC wasn't the only paramilitary organization set up under Roosevelt. Even more ominous was the National Recovery Administration. This was led by Hugh Johnson, who, not coincidentally, had been a military liaison to the War Industries Board in World War I and director of the World War I draft. Who can fail to see in the Blue Eagle, symbol of national recovery, with its lightning bolts and industrial cogwheel, a startling resemblance to the Nazi swastika? The public display of the Blue Eagle was a sign of compliance with the NRA's demands. In order to keep prices high, price controls were instated and no one was allowed to undersell. Farm animals were destroyed and agricultural crops left to rot in the fields. Higgs again. It is not possible, says William Graham Sumner, to experiment with the society and just drop the experiment whenever we choose. The experiment enters into the life of society and never can be got out again. World War I, the New Deal, and World War II gave rise to the greatest experiments in collectivization America had ever experienced. These experiments radically transformed the political economy, institutionally and ideologically. The political economy of 1948 bore scarcely any resemblance to that of 1912, and the changes gave every indication of being irreversible. In the process by which this radical transformation occurred, the military draft played a central part. Conscription made possible the creation of a huge armed force in 1917-1918, which in turn required massive amounts of complementary resources. To get these resources, the government had to raise taxes enormously, go deeply into debt, and impose a great variety of controls on the market economy. That is, it had to override traditional limitations on government action and to disallow long-standing economic liberties. In light of the apparent success of the policies employed during World War I, the temptation to impose similar policies during the Great Depression proved irresistible. In large part, the New Deal consisted of quasi-war policies to deal with a pseudo-war emergency. Participation in World War II, with its global reach and voracious demand for resources, increased every aspect of the process by an order of magnitude. The draft permitted the creation of a huge army, which gave rise to vast military resource requirements that could be met expeditiously only by imposition of a command and control system throughout the economy. By the late 1940s, the three great experiments had entered, institutionally and ideologically, into the life of society. With all the fundamental barriers to the growth of government having been battered down during war and pseudo-war emergencies, nothing substantial remained to impede the relentless growth of government. So writes Higgs. The absolute sovereignty of the state led inexorably to totalitarianism, legitimizing the extension of state control into every aspect of human life. The term totalitarian was coined in the 1920s by Giovanni Amendola. Totalitarianism is thought of as having the following features: an official ideology to which all must conform, an ideology directed towards a state of human perfection, controlled by a single mass party under the direction of a leader and his associates, a system of terror exercised by the party and its police, a monopoly of communication, a monopoly control of combat weapons, and central control and direction of the economy. According to Grieder, totalitarianism is the concerted but disguised attempt by a state to exercise total control over, coerce, integrate, manipulate, mobilize, and seduce its population in the name of an ideology, whether such ambitions were actually realized or not. Gregor's account is broadly in line with Grieder's. For him, totalitarian regimes are characterized by an ideology which is critical of the past while making chiastic claims of the future, by a mass movement organized in a single party under the control of a supposedly charismatic leader with his accompanying tutelary elite, by a monopoly or near monopoly of the means of coercion and communication, and by the centralized and bureaucratic control of the entire economy. The word totalitarian is now a bad word, a word that describes something intrinsically evil. But it wasn't always so. When fascism was fashionable, totalitarianism was in vogue. The disappearance of the word doesn't mean that the reality it names has also disappeared. In fact, it is still with us, but is now much more likely to be called holism or inclusivity. Totalitarianism can be a father who smacks you around the head to make you do what you are told for your own good, or a mother who talks at you incessantly to make you do whatever it is she wants you to do for your own good. Today, the paternal variety is out of fashion, and the maternal variety is in the ascendant. Jonah Goldberg writes, "Liberalism today sees no realm of human life that is beyond political significance, from what you eat to what you smoke, to what you say. Sex is political, food is political, sports, entertainment, your inner motives and outer appearance all have political salience for liberal fascists. Liberals place their faith in priestly experts who know better, to plan, exhort, badger, and scold. Gregor agrees with this, writing, "In the 20th century, political life has become increasingly integrative and totalitarian, in the sense that no aspect of life is conceived to be in principle private and unpolitical. With the decline of religion, politics has become its secular surrogate." Fascism loves community, collectivities, nations, groups, all of which take precedence over the individual and his petty needs and concerns. Fascism is impatient with political disagreements and urges that we go beyond politics in the interests of the nation. Fascists believe fervently that a better world can be made here and now, even if some people have to be discommoded in the process. Common to both fascism and National Socialism was the idea that internal conflict within the state or society was a waste of energy and resources, and that a country ought to be able to develop all its resources cooperatively, without the waste and friction of the class struggle, and with a fair distribution of the product between capital and labour. So writes Sabine. If the group is to come together as one, all divisions must be submerged, and all the sources of division must be suppressed as much as possible. One tried and tested method of getting squabbling combatants to unite is to give them a common enemy, and the best way to do this is to have them fight a war. "There's a war on, you know," is the Dad's Army catchphrase used to put an end to all selfish objections. The only condition that submerges the divergent social and economic interests of a modern nation is preparation for war. Accordingly, Fascism and National Socialism were in essence war governments and war economies set up not as expedients to meet a national emergency, but as permanent political systems. If you want to suppress civil liberties, then you need a war. If not a war on other people, then a war on inanimate objects or abstract entities, a war on drugs, or a war on poverty, or a war on terror. If all internal divisions are to cease and all internal competitive differentiation is to disappear, then the state becomes all in all. There can be nothing apart from the state. No unions or trade organizations, no independent businesses, no rival centers of authority or control. Religion becomes subordinate to the state, likewise education. No area of privacy remained that an individual could call his own, and no association of individuals which was not subject to political control. In Italy, education was completely subordinated to the ends of the state, including education in the universities. Giuseppe Bottai, Mussolini's Minister of Education from 1936 to 1943, wrote in 1928 that the role of the university under fascism lies in laying the basis for living culture, one which creates a class of men able to provide leadership in politics, science and art. The university must adapt so as to be able to fulfill a task of this sort. If the need for a cultural revolution is above all palpable in legal, political, economic and social studies, it is no less urgent in other types of study, which often pursue lines of inquiry which still conflict with the fascist train of the character and mind of Italians. Intermediate organizations and bodies of all sorts were either eliminated or else dominated, including all forms of mutual aid organizations, as well as labor unions and business organizations. The effect of all this was to create a wasteland between the state and the individual. On one side, the state. On the other, a mass of socially naked individuals. Though the individual was organized at every turn, he stood more alone than ever before. Totalitarian society was truly atomic. The people were literally the masses, without information except what propaganda agencies chose to give them, and without power to combine for any purposes of their own. The net result of all this centralization was, as you might expect, chaos and confusion. Overlapping and multiple forms of control were set up and, needless to say, individuals attempted to carve out their own particular spheres of influence without regard to the overall impact such carving up would have on the whole. George Sabine notes that National Socialist totalitarianism never achieved a rational division of functions in any branch of government or an organization into governing agencies with legally defined powers that acted predictably according to known rules. The law became an ad hoc mode of decision-making to be administered in accordance with a subjective estimation of what constituted wrongdoing. According to corporatist doctrine, Employers and employees were supposed to be represented in the running of firms. In effect, however, the result was just the same as occurred in Germany. Firms lost their freedom of action, and both the management and labour became mere tools of the state. Ultimate control was put into the hands of state functionaries. Italian corporatism found its Teutonic twin in the Nazi doctrine of Gleichschaltung. This doctrine, which sounds distinctly harmless in its English translation of coordination, demands the orientation of all activities, all organizations and institutions, churches, schools, universities, clubs, trade unions, industry, agriculture, trade, radio, newspapers, cinema and literature, so that all think in line with the Führer. Central control, central planning, is not only characteristic of fascism and National Socialism, but also notoriously of Bolshevism. For all of these regimes, the achievement of the nation's end implies a central direction of all its activities and the elimination of distracting tendencies that might deflect it from its goals. Griffin writes, "The convinced fascist is a utopian, conceiving the homogeneous, perfectly coordinated national community as a total solution to the problems of modern society." Given the complexity of any society of even a moderate size, such massive attempts at central control and direction are never likely to succeed, but it doesn't prevent the attempts from seriously disrupting the lives of individuals and communities. Despite their international ambitions, all these regimes converged on nationalism in the end. This narrowing of focus might cause doctrinal difficulties for Bolshevism, but not for fascism or National Socialism. The philosopher Ugo Spirito, writing in 1932, argues that, in contrast to socialism, fascism looks to a system of international collaboration in which, without succumbing to what he calls the anarchy of individualistic laissez-faire, every country will organize its own economy in a planned way, which takes account of the organization prevailing in other countries and comes to an arrangement with them on how best to coordinate different programs. Some fascist thinkers thought of fascist flirtation with private property as a mere transitional stage. Ugo Spirito, for example, thought that fascism would ultimately divest itself of residual capitalist elements to become an integral corporativism, in which private property would no longer constitute loci of particular interest, independent of and conceivably opposed to the interests of the state. The terms used to describe this post-transitional stage are revealing: fascist communism, fascist Bolshevism, and fascist socialism.